I still remember the sound more than anything else. Not shouting, not crying. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of people has already decided who's guilty. I was standing there, hands locked together so tightly my fingers hurt, while my name floated around the room like something rotten. I could feel eyes on my back, some curious, some satisfied, most judgmental. No one asked me anything. No one needed to. In their minds, the story was already complete. She ruined the marriage. She gave up too easily. She broke the family. Every word landed without being spoken. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing against my chest. I could hear my own breathing, uneven and shallow, fighting to stay calm. Somewhere nearby, someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted their chair. Life moved on normally for everyone else, while mine was being quietly buried. I searched the room for one face, just one, the person who knew the truth. They were there, close enough to see, close enough to stop it. They didn't. That's when I understood something that hurt more than the divorce itself. It wasn't just that my marriage had ended. It was that I had been sacrificed to protect someone else's version of the story. I wanted to scream, to explain, to tear open the years I had swallowed my pain and throw it on the floor for everyone to see. But my mouth wouldn't open. My body felt frozen, like if I moved even an inch, I would completely fall apart. What made it worse was how confident everyone looked, as if they knew me, as if they had lived inside my walls, as if they had survived what I survived. They didn't see the nights I slept facing the wall, silent tears soaking the pillow so no one would hear. They didn't see the way I learned to apologize for things I didn't do just to keep the peace. They didn't see how slowly I disappeared trying to save something that was already destroying me. All they saw was the ending, and endings are easy to judge. As I stood there, blamed and stripped of my dignity, one question kept echoing in my head. Louder than the silence, louder than the judgment, louder than the shame. If everyone thinks I destroyed the marriage, why does it feel like I'm the only one who survived it? Before anyone decided I was the reason everything fell apart, there was a time when this relationship was my entire world. I didn't enter it halfway. I entered it believing I was building something permanent, something worth bending for. I gave it the best parts of me, the patient parts, the hopeful parts, the parts that believed love meant endurance. I adjusted my life around it without keeping count, small compromises at first, changing plans, letting go of personal goals because now wasn't the right time. I told myself this was normal, that this was what commitment looked like. Every relationship needs sacrifice, right? I never questioned how often the sacrificing came from my side. I remember defending us to people who raised concerns. I brushed off comments, laughed away warnings, convinced myself outsiders didn't understand what we had. I believed loyalty meant protecting the relationship from criticism, even when that criticism made me uncomfortable. I didn't realize I was slowly training myself not to listen to my own instincts. There were moments that should have stayed with me longer, conversations that ended abruptly, promises that felt rushed, like they were meant to end the discussion rather than solve anything. A growing distance that I explained away as stress, responsibility, bad timing. I kept choosing understanding over honesty, especially with myself. I became skilled at minimizing my own hurt. If something felt wrong, I told myself I was overthinking. If I felt lonely, I convinced myself it was temporary. I learned how to swallow disappointment without making noise. I learned how to smile through confusion so no one would ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. The truth is, I was proud of how much I could endure. I wore it like proof of my love. I believed that if I stayed long enough, patient enough, supportive enough, things would eventually return to how they used to be. I held on to memories instead of reality, replaying better moments whenever the present felt too heavy. But cracks don't announce themselves loudly. They show up in patterns, missed connections, emotional absences, a feeling of being alone even when someone is right beside you. I noticed I was speaking less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't feel heard. My thoughts stayed in my head longer. My feelings became easier to dismiss than explain. What scared me most was how normal it all began to feel. The imbalance, the silence, the sense that I was working to preserve something the other person no longer protected. Love started to feel less like partnership and more like responsibility I was carrying alone. Still, I stayed, not because I was weak, but because I believed in what we were supposed to be. I believed walking away meant failure. I believed enduring quietly was stronger than questioning loudly. I didn't know then that this loyalty, this willingness to stay and absorb everything, would later be used as evidence against me, that the years I spent holding us together would be erased, that when everything finally collapsed, no one would ask how long I had been surviving before I ever thought about leaving. I trusted the wrong silence, and I didn't yet realize how expensive that trust would become. The moment everything broke wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no obvious explosion. That's what made it worse. Betrayal didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in quietly, disguised as something ordinary. I remember the exact instant my body reacted before my mind did. A tightening in my chest, a sudden heat behind my eyes, a feeling I couldn't name yet but couldn't ignore either. Something was wrong, and for the first time, I didn't rush to explain it away. What I discovered wasn't supposed to be seen. It wasn't handed to me. It wasn't confessed. It was something I stumbled into, something that existed whether I was looking or not. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. At first, I tried to be reasonable. I told myself there had to be context, that I was missing part of the story, that love meant giving the benefit of the doubt. I replayed everything in my head, searching for explanations that would soften the impact. My loyalty didn't disappear instantly, it fought back. But the details didn't align. The timelines didn't make sense. The emotional distance I had felt for months suddenly had a shape. What I once blamed on stress or exhaustion now looked intentional, calculated, chosen. The hardest part wasn't what happened, it was realizing how long it might have been happening, how many moments I had trusted that were never real, how many times I defended someone who already knew I was being replaced in the story. I felt embarrassed by how deeply I wanted it to be a misunderstanding. I wanted to be wrong more than I wanted to be respected. That realization alone hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. My mind split into two voices. One begged me to stay quiet, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, to protect what little stability remained. The other kept asking why I was always the one expected to carry the damage, why the truth was suddenly my burden to manage. Every memory started rearranging itself. Conversations felt different in hindsight. Affection felt strategic. Absence felt deliberate. It was like watching my past re-edit itself without my permission. What hurt most was the clarity. Betrayal removes confusion. Once the denial cracked, everything became painfully sharp. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't too sensitive. I wasn't asking for too much. I was reacting exactly the way someone does when they've been lied to for too long. I didn't confront anyone immediately, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand what I was standing on. I needed to know whether this was a mistake or a pattern, whether the person I trusted was capable of choosing me or had already chosen something else. The weight of that knowledge was unbearable in silence. I carried it through normal days, ordinary routines, conversations that felt fake now. Every interaction felt like acting in a play where I was the only one who had read the real script. And still, a part of me hesitated, because acknowledging betrayal meant accepting that everything I had sacrificed might have been for someone who never planned to protect me. That's when the denial finally lost its grip. I wasn't just hurt, I had been deceived, and once that truth settled in my chest, I knew nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever go back to how it was. After the betrayal revealed itself, life didn't slow down to let me process it. It sped up. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened while I was expected to function normally, with the truth burning inside my chest. I started noticing how carefully everything around me was being managed. What was said, what was avoided, what was rewritten. The narrative was forming without me. I wasn't part of the conversation. I was the conclusion. Subtle pressure came first, suggestions disguised as concern, advice framed as protection. I was encouraged to stay calm, to be patient, to not make things worse. Silence was presented as maturity, endurance was praised. Speaking up, I was warned, would only hurt everyone involved. Every time I considered saying something, I could already feel the backlash waiting. I could see how easily the story would flip, how my pain would be labeled as bitterness, how my questions would be twisted into accusations. It became clear that truth wasn't welcome. Compliance was. I felt trapped between two impossible choices. If I stayed quiet, I disappeared. If I spoke, I became the problem. The pressure didn't just come from one place. It seeped in from all directions. Family members started treating me differently, cautiously, like I was unstable. Friends stopped asking real questions and started offering rehearsed comfort. I could feel their curiosity turning into judgment the longer I didn't explain myself. Meanwhile, the person who betrayed me moved with unsettling ease, calm, controlled, almost relieved. Watching them function without guilt made me question my own reality. I wondered if maybe I was the one exaggerating. Maybe I was holding on to something that didn't matter as much as it felt. But my body didn't lie. The anxiety stayed. Sleep became shallow. My thoughts raced at night, replaying moments I hadn't questioned before. I was constantly bracing myself, like something was about to happen, even though nothing ever did. The isolation grew quietly. I stopped sharing details because every explanation felt risky. I measured my words, my expressions, my reactions. I became hyper-aware of how I was being perceived, as if my entire character was under review. The worst part was realizing how alone this made me feel in a space that was supposed to be shared. I was carrying a secret I didn't choose, protecting people who weren't protecting me. And the longer I stayed silent, the heavier it became. There were moments when I almost broke, moments when I wanted to blurt everything out just to breathe again. But fear held me back. Not fear of confrontation, but fear of being dismissed. Fear that the truth wouldn't matter once the labels had already been assigned. The stakes were rising in ways no one else could see. This wasn't just about a relationship anymore. It was about my identity, my credibility, the story that would follow me long after the divorce papers were signed. I could feel the walls closing in. Every day I stayed quiet, the narrative hardened. And I knew that if I waited too long, even the truth might not be enough to undo the damage. Something had to give. Either I would continue absorbing the pressure until there was nothing left of me, or I would find a way to reclaim control before the story finished writing itself without me. The confrontation didn't happen the way I imagined it would. There was no dramatic setup, no raised voices echoing through a room. It happened in a space that was supposed to feel safe, which somehow made it sharper, more cutting. I didn't go in angry. I went in tired. Tired of carrying questions alone. Tired of pretending I didn't know what I knew. Tired of watching my silence become permission. I needed clarity, not reassurance, not excuses, just honesty. Something solid I could stand on. What I got instead was confidence. Not remorse, not hesitation. Confidence so smooth it almost felt rehearsed. Every word was carefully chosen, polished enough to sound reasonable, distant enough to avoid responsibility. I could feel the imbalance immediately. I was there seeking truth. They were there protecting an image. As I spoke, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't being heard, I was being evaluated. My reactions, my tone, my emotions were being measured, not to understand me, but to see how much control still remained. The denial wasn't loud, it was calm, strategic, the kind that makes you question yourself mid-sentence. Facts were blurred, timelines softened, accountability diluted into vague explanations. I found myself defending my own memory, my own experience, like I was on trial for noticing the damage. And then came the line. Not shouted, not cruel on the surface, just casually dismissive, delivered with a small, almost amused expression. A sentence that suggested I was overreacting, that implied my pain was exaggerated, that framed my hurt as inconvenience. In that moment, something inside me cracked open. I saw it clearly then. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was someone who believed they could outmaneuver the truth simply by staying calm longer than I could. The realization was devastating and clarifying at the same time. I stopped trying to convince. I stopped explaining how much it hurt. I stopped reaching for validation that was never coming. Instead, I watched, and what I saw confirmed everything I had been afraid to admit. There was no intention to take responsibility, no urgency to repair what was broken, only a quiet expectation that I would eventually accept this version of events and move on quietly. The emotional breaking point wasn't explosive, it was internal, a shift so subtle no one else could see it, but I felt it fully. It was the moment I understood that staying meant continuing to disappear. I left that conversation heavier than when I entered, but also strangely clearer. The confusion was gone. In its place was a deep, aching certainty. I had been loyal to someone who no longer saw me as a person, only as a problem to be managed. After that, the pressure intensified, the distance grew colder, the story about me became sharper, less forgiving. I could sense how easily I was being positioned as difficult, emotional, unstable, anything but honest. But something had changed in me. The breaking point had passed. The fear that once kept me quiet was being replaced by something else. Not anger, not revenge, resolve. I didn't need to argue anymore. I didn't need to beg for understanding. I didn't need to force the truth into a space that refused to hold it. What I needed was proof. And even though no one else knew it yet, I had already started paying attention differently, listening more carefully, remembering more clearly, watching the cracks widen where confidence had once seemed unshakable. They thought the conversation ended in their favor. They had no idea it was only the beginning. I wasn't looking for anything when the shift happened. By that point, I had learned to move carefully, to expect nothing, to protect whatever was left of my energy. I had stopped trying to force answers and started paying attention instead. That's when things began to surface on their own. The first detail felt insignificant, almost forgettable. A small inconsistency that didn't match the version of events I had been fed. Under normal circumstances, I might have ignored it, but now, with everything else already fractured, it stood out like a loose thread. Once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing others. Dates didn't align. Explanations changed slightly depending on the audience. Reactions didn't match the seriousness of the situation. None of it proved anything on its own, but together it formed a pattern that felt undeniable. Then came the unexpected element, the one I never anticipated. It wasn't dramatic or confrontational. It arrived quietly, through an overlooked detail, a record that hadn't been meant for me, a piece of information that existed outside anyone's carefully constructed narrative. Holding that knowledge felt different from holding suspicion. This wasn't emotion, this was structure, something concrete, something that didn't depend on how I felt or how convincingly anyone spoke. For the first time in months, the power dynamic shifted. I stopped reacting. I stopped defending myself. I stopped trying to be understood. I became still. And that stillness did something interesting. It made other people uncomfortable. The person who once seemed so confident began to misstep. Small things at first. Over-explaining, correcting themselves, watching my reactions more closely than before. They could sense the change, even if they didn't yet know why. I didn't reveal what I knew, not yet. I needed the truth to settle, to show me its full shape. I needed to understand not just what happened, but how deep it went, how long it had been hidden, how many times I had been positioned as the problem to keep it buried. There was a strange calm that came with this stage. Not relief, clarity. The anxiety that once consumed me started to fade, replaced by focus. I slept better, I thought more clearly, I trusted myself again. I also saw how fragile the lies were once I stopped propping them up. Without my silence actively supporting them, they began to sag under their own weight. Contradictions appeared more frequently, stories shifted more noticeably, the mask slipped in ways I didn't need to point out. I wasn't planning revenge, I wasn't rehearsing a confrontation, I was preparing for alignment, for the moment when truth and timing would meet. The most powerful realization came quietly. I no longer needed anyone's permission to believe myself. I didn't need public validation to know what I had survived. The truth didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like grounding. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer walking into the final phase of this story empty-handed. The balance had shifted. They just didn't know it yet. And when the truth finally surfaced, when it did what truth always does, it wouldn't need me to raise my voice. It would speak for itself. The truth didn't come out the way I once imagined. There was no dramatic announcement, no single moment where everything paused. Instead, it surfaced all at once, inevitable, undeniable, and impossible to contain. By the time it happened, the version of me everyone expected, the defensive one, the emotional one, the one begging to be believed, no longer existed. I didn't need to push the truth forward. Circumstances did it for me. Details that were supposed to stay hidden collided. Timelines overlapped where they shouldn't have. Statements contradicted each other publicly. What had once been carefully separated began to converge in a way no explanation could smooth over. I watched it unfold from a distance, almost detached. The same people who once avoided my eyes were suddenly looking at me differently. Confusion replaced certainty. The confidence that once filled the room drained slowly, replaced by uncomfortable silence. What struck me most was how quickly judgment shifted once facts entered the space. The same voices that had blamed me began asking different questions, not out of compassion, but out of disbelief. They weren't asking if I was hurt anymore. They were asking how long this had been going on without anyone noticing. The person who built the narrative couldn't hold it together anymore. Their calm fractured. Explanations became rushed. The certainty that once made me doubt myself collapsed under the weight of evidence they couldn't outrun. For the first time, I wasn't the one explaining. I wasn't justifying my reactions or defending my decisions. I was silent, and that silence carried more weight than anything I could have said. The exposure wasn't loud, but it was complete. Every missing piece clicked into place, forming a picture no one could unsee. What had been framed as my failure was revealed as my endurance. What had been labeled abandonment was survival. I felt something unexpected in that moment. Not triumph, not revenge. Relief. Relief that I no longer had to carry the truth alone. Relief that my reality was no longer isolated inside me. Relief that the version of me built on accusation finally dissolved. Justice didn't arrive with apologies. It arrived with recognition, with faces that could no longer look away, with a quiet understanding that a mistake had been made, and that mistake had a name that wasn't mine. I didn't speak much when the truth settled. I didn't need to. The facts stood on their own. And in that stillness, I reclaimed something I thought I had lost forever, my sense of self. The betrayal was no longer a question. The damage was no longer debatable. The roles had reversed without me lifting a finger. What everyone once believed had collapsed under its own weight. And standing there, no longer blamed, no longer doubted, I realized something powerful. The truth didn't just clear my name, it ended the control they thought they had over my story. After the truth came out, I expected something dramatic to follow. An apology, an explanation, some acknowledgement of the damage that had been done. But what came instead was quieter and somehow more final. People didn't rush toward me. They stepped back. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations changed tone. Eyes that once judged now avoided lingering too long. The certainty everyone carried about me dissolved, replaced by discomfort. Not because they suddenly cared about my pain, but because they realized how wrong they had been. The person who benefited from my silence didn't fight anymore. There was nothing left to defend. The story they had leaned on for so long no longer worked. Without my reputation to hide behind, the consequences landed where they always should have. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't need to. What mattered more was what happened inside me. The constant tightness in my chest eased. The need to explain myself faded. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped wondering how I could have said things differently. The past finally felt finished instead of unresolved. Healing didn't look like forgetting, it looked like acceptance. I accepted that I had loved deeply, that I had stayed longer than I should have because I believed in commitment, that trusting someone who betrayed me didn't make me weak, it made me human, and surviving what followed made me stronger than I ever had to be before. There are still moments when the weight returns, certain places, certain dates, certain memories that remind me of how invisible I once felt. But they don't control me anymore. They don't define me. I walked away from that chapter with my integrity intact. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need public sympathy. I needed my name back, my sense of self back, and I took it with me. What I learned is simple, but it took everything to understand it. Being blamed doesn't mean being guilty. Being quiet doesn't mean being wrong. And surviving something silently doesn't mean it didn't hurt. I don't tell this story to prove anything. I tell it because someone listening right now might be standing where I once stood, confused, doubted, carrying a truth no one seems interested in hearing. If that's you, know this. The truth has a way of resurfacing, even when you stop fighting for it. And when it does, it doesn't need permission. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. Comment if you've ever been blamed for something you survived, and share this with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone. Some stories don't need shouting. They just need to be told.